Hello. As you can see, I am dressed as the character L from Death Note. Or to some people, I'm just dressed as a normal person. I'm gonna stop this is cringy. So, welcome back. It's been a while since I've decided to post a video on this channel. I know I have plenty of fans all over the world who have been patiently awaiting my return. I'm finally in a good position to make videos. Just this past weekend, I finished building my computer. It is complete. Look, it is the Con Man Does Gaming. And if I recall correctly, I said in the first video on this channel that I'd be building a computer sometime soon.
I will get a better computer sometime soon. I will guarantee that.
Almost 3 years later, it's finally happened. Hopefully I'm here to stay this time, but anyway, Death Note. Netflix decided to make a movie based on an anime. That worked out pretty well. But hey, who cares about that? You're here to see my review, assuming you didn't just accidentally click on this video and you actually care about me and my content, right? Right? So I'm gonna split this review into two parts. Part one is gonna be for people who have not seen the original anime or read the manga or whatever the heck you want to say, and that's gonna just be a review of the movie as a movie. The second half is gonna be for people who have, and it's gonna be more of an analysis, spoiler discussion type thing, I'll make it very clear when that part in the video shows up. So, Death Note is about this kid named Light. In the original, he's named Light Yagami, obviously because it was in Japan, who's in high school, and one day he discovers this Death Note. Timmy Turner over here gets a fairly godparent named Ryuk, played by Willem Dafoe, when he discovers this notebook, and basically what this notebook allows him to do is if he writes down the name of someone in the book and images their face in his head, then he can kill that person. And basically what he wants to do with this power is he wants to do the good thing. He wants to use it to get rid of all the criminals in the world. And one day, this girl at school named Mia finds out about this book, and they team up to create this persona known as Kira to kill all the criminals. And after a couple of murders, the police start getting suspicious, and this guy named L comes in, who's this really good detective, and he basically wants to find out the true identity behind Kira. And there you have your movie. So, let's cut right to it. Is Death Note good? Kind of. I mean, it's a fine movie. You can watch it and be entertained for an hour and a half, or however long this movie is. I mean, it says an hour 40 everywhere I look, but getting rid of the credits is an hour and a half, which I feel like is a big downside to this story, but I'll get to that later during the spoiler section. So I guess I'll just first get into the cast. The guy who plays Light, I think his name is Nat Wolff, and I think he does a good job. A lot of people are giving him flack for his performance, but personally I think he did fine. He was a believable person in my opinion, and I feel like he did well with what he was given. Although his character, however, not so much. Overall, I feel like he did well with the role. Then you have L. He's played by, I forget his name. Lakeith Stanfield. Yeah, my boy Lakeith. I think he did pretty good. I mean, I really liked him. He was one of my favorite parts of the movie, alongside Ryuk, who is played by Willem Dafoe. By the way, that is a perfect casting decision. Now, a lot of people were triggered when it was originally announced who would be playing who in this because they weren't being played by Japanese people or whatever. Now, personally, I don't care about that. I don't care who's playing them as long as they capture the integrity of the characters, and they play them well, which is why I'm fine that L is black. Even though L is supposed to be, like, the whitest guy on Earth. Oh yeah, and Light's dad as well in this movie, who's played by, Shea Wiggum, who's a pretty good actor. I feel like he did a really good job. And also, Mia, the person who plays Mia, Margaret Qualley, I feel like she did a good job, too. There really is no bad performance in this movie. Everyone does a good job overall, but what's more important than that is characters. Personally, I believe they didn't really get the characters very well in this movie. They're much different than they were in the original, except for L and Ryuk, but even they have changed them, but I'll get to that later. Overall, I feel like Light, who's the main protagonist of this story, he's just kind of generic. Overall, I feel like this movie falls into that trap. At the beginning, it's nice and interesting, I could get into it, but after a certain point in the movie, like halfway through, the movie just gets like generic, becomes like another young adult romance movie with a supernatural twist. And by romance, I mean Light and Mia have a romance in this movie, which kind of felt unnecessary and goes completely against what actually happened in the original story, but once again, I'll get to that later. If there was something that stood out, I guess it's the visual style of this movie. The cinematography is really nice. All the lighting is really nice, although there is a gripe that I have. Now, I've only watched through this movie once, but from what I remember, like, every other shot was a Dutch angle. And if you don't know what a Dutch angle is, it's when they put the camera on an angle to communicate something is off during a scene. Yeah, there were, like, plenty of those in this movie, and now that I think about it, it kind of poses a bit of an issue for the filmmakers, because if they actually wanted to use a Dutch angle to communicate something was off during a scene, you wouldn't be able to tell, because every other scene is like that. Unless the idea that they were trying to communicate is that the entire movie is off, which, now that I think about it, isn't too inaccurate. But anyway, this movie is relatively well paced paced. Although it is a very short movie, so it is very quickly paced, and there are things that they did in the story clearly to make it fit within that runtime. I mean, the original series is like 40 episodes long. That's a lot of ideas to fit into one movie. That part of it definitely shows. Overall, it's nothing special. I mean, like I said, you can watch it and be entertained, but you won't remember it. Hopefully what this movie will do is when someone watches it, they'll be like, that was fine, that was pretty cool, I guess. And then maybe if they're interested enough, they'll go, hey, maybe I should watch the actual anime. And then they'll watch it and they'll realize how much better it is. Speaking of that, even if you haven't seen the original series, you can still watch this movie. The movie is so different from the original source material that there are no spoilers in this movie for you if you have not read the original or seen the original. But yeah, that's all I really have to say for the non-spoiler section of the review. Now onto the spoiler section of the review. Let's get into the meat of it. Now, before I get into this, I want to make it very clear that I'm a very recent fan to Death Note. I only watched it about a month ago. Now, Death Note was always something that was on my mind, but I was never really motivated to watch it until they announced that they were making a movie adaptation. So basically, I told myself, hey, I'm gonna watch this series in preparation for the movie, and I ended up binging it within a couple of days. Anyway, basically the point I'm trying to make here is that I am going in with a more neutral standpoint. I mean, I love the original series, but I just don't have that history with it. You know, it's not like I grew up with Death Note, is what I'm trying to say. With that being said, if I were to summarize this movie within a couple of words, it would probably be missed opportunity. I mean, I feel like this project was doomed from the start, just by being a movie. Hold up, it's me from the future. I'm interrupting the video because I want to retract the point I just made there. A good film adaptation is perfectly possible as long as you have a solid script and the right person for the job. And as I began to wonder, I started thinking who would be the right person for the job. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that person would probably be Christopher Nolan. Now, I'm a big fan of Christopher Nolan and his filmography, but I'm not choosing him just because he's Christopher Nolan. I'm choosing him because I feel like the story of Death Note suits his style perfectly. The story explores a lot of philosophical ideas, the characters are cold and contemplative, and Christopher Nolan has proven in the past that he's perfectly capable of taking a layered story like Death Note and condensing it into a movie, and I go to The Dark Knight as a piece of evidence for this. The Dark Knight is a movie that's actually very similar to Death Note in a lot of ways. It speaks a lot about justice, and the dynamic between Batman and the Joker is actually very similar to the dynamic between Light and L. They have a huge battle of ideologies in that movie. And if you think Death Note is too campy of a concept for Christopher Nolan to take on, he took the concept of this guy who dresses up like a bat to take out this crazy dude who wears makeup like a clown and turned it into a visceral crime thriller. There's no question in my mind that he could do the same with a story like Death Note. And he took all of that and put it into one 2.5 hour movie. And I believe that if there ever was a great Death Note movie adaptation, it would have to be around that length. And despite Death Note's quite outlandish story, it's grounded enough to prevent Christopher Nolan from getting too overly ambitious. Now, it'll probably never happen, but I cross my fingers that it does one day, because a Death Note movie by Christopher Nolan would be amazing. But yeah, that's enough of my rambling. Let me get back to the video. Like I said, that's 37 22-minute episodes, each with a ton of content, and trying to fit all of that into one movie is basically impossible without making some major cuts to the story, and that's what this movie did. Now, I've seen people in like the comments section say stuff like, oh, the weeaboos get so triggered even if the slightest change is made to their precious anime. Now, I don't consider myself a weeaboo, but I disagree with that statement, because that statement would be true if the changes were slight. I mean, this movie not only makes major cuts to the story, it also makes major cuts to the original ideas that made Death Note great in the first place. Let me put it this way. In stories, there are themes. Themes that organize the story, that structure a story. In Death Note, the original Death Note, there are two major themes that I can think of. Theme number one is about justice. What is justice? Who decides justice? And what happens when it goes too far? You know, that type of thing. Number two is how power can corrupt an individual. That is explored through Light and other people who obtain the power of the Death Note, but mainly through Light's character. And that's what I want to talk about here, is the changes that they made to specifically Light and L, because even though the original Death Note is about this Death Note that allows you to kill people, it's really more about the relationship between Light and L, and Light and L's characters. Light, in this movie, he's just an ordinary high school student. Sure, he's kinda bright, but he's nothing like he was in the original, where he was a genius, basically. Ryuk says it himself in the original that he couldn't think of a better person for the Death Note to go to. And because of that, people are asking the question, you know, why is Light in high school in this movie? And honestly, he could be 20-something years old. He could be out of college. But in the original story, the reason why he was in high school that I can think of is because he was, like, a perfect student. He was straight A honors student, which is a very honorable position, especially in Japan. And I feel like the point that they were trying to make there, which plays into the power can corrupt theme, is that even the most perfect seeming of people can be corrupted by power. And they don't have that because Light is not a genius. And you can see how that can pose a bit of a problem for later parts of the story, but I'll get to that soon. And the thing is, Light also in this movie, he just wants to kill criminals. That's his whole idea. He doesn't want to kill anybody else, which completely goes against the original point of his character. In the original story, he was willing to kill whoever he needed to in order to forward his agenda. He doesn't do that in this movie. Ironically, who does do that in this movie is Misa's character, who I should say Mia, for the sake of American audience, but yeah, she's the one that's actually willing to get her hands dirty in order to forward this idea of Kira, which is very ironic. In the original story, Light uses Misa. In this story, Misa uses Light. And people are making the point that Misa is actually more like Kira in this movie than Light is, which is very true and quite ironic. So yeah, now to L's character, who for the most part I feel like they nailed pretty well, at least for the first half of this movie, and he's really well played by Lakeith Stanfield. And I feel like Lakeith Stanfield played him very well, despite the changes that they made to his character. At the beginning, he's the L that everybody knows. He's the weird guy who's very kind of antisocial and eats candy all the time, and is like, you know, doing the Spider-Man. You know? In the scenes that there were interactions between L and Light, I found it very interesting, but they really skimmed the surface with that, but I'll get to that soon. L, for the most part at the beginning, is pretty close to the original, but then something happens to him, and then he lets his emotions overcloud his actions, which is annoying because that's something the original L would never do. He would always be headstrong, always focused on his work, letting nothing get in the way of that, and that's the same with Light. In this movie, they're not like that at all. I mean, Light's not a genius. L lets his emotions take over his actions, and because of that you lose the entire interaction that they had in the original story. Them playing mind games on each other, having that battle of wits, is completely gone in this movie, and that was a huge part of what made the original Death Note so good, at least the first half or so of the series. And it's really a missed opportunity because they use characters as a means to communicate their themes, those two themes that I talked about earlier, and since the characters are different from the original, they can't communicate those themes, and because of that it completely loses the point of what made Death Note good in the first place. You could say that, oh, they're trying to be original with the story, but that doesn't work here because the whole point is you're not adapting Death Note to bring it to an American audience by taking the names of characters that were in the original and applying them to different characters. You're adapting Death Note because it's Death Note. You're adapting that property because it was so good and popular in the first place. So in order to do that, you need to respect the things that made it good. Either that or you make a completely new story with new characters surrounding it. And because it failed to capture that, in my opinion, Death Note failed as an adaptation. As a movie, it's fine, and they even leave it open at the end as if there's going to be a sequel. I think the director actually stated that depending on the reception of this movie, there would be a sequel, but I feel like they've already gone too far down the rabbit hole with this one. They've already messed up the characters enough that there's not really much that they can go on with. Personally, I say either completely restart or just drop it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Death Note. In summary, I feel like overall it's a fine movie that you can watch and be entertained, but it fails particularly as an adaptation because it failed to communicate the themes and maintain the characters and their interactions, which made it so good in the first place. And honestly, in my opinion, if they did keep those, then the overall movie would have been better. But yeah, that's all I have to say about Death Note. If you've made it this far in the video, I have to say I'm impressed. I guess if you liked it, you can, you know, click that red button down there. There's a word on it. It starts with an S. I need all the views. I need the YouTube money. I'm a very poor man. I'm living on the street. I live in a box. I have no technology. Help.